If you've ever lain awake at 2 in the morning thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing with my life, you're far from alone. In fact, you're in the majority. Somewhere between your mid-20s and late 30s, there's a strange kind of ache that so many people feel but rarely say out loud. You look around at your job, your relationships, your bank account, your sense of purpose, and instead of clarity, you find fog. And what makes it worse is the quiet suspicion that everyone else got a map, and you somehow missed the meeting where they handed it out. Here's the truth. There was no meeting. There is no map. And the fog you're feeling isn't a personal failure. It's a well-documented psychological stage that researchers actually have a name for. Today, we're going to explore why this period of life produces so much uncertainty, why the expectations we carry into our 20s and 30s often make things worse rather than better, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it. Not vague affirmations. Real, research-backed strategies for building a sense of direction, even when you don't have all the answers. Let's start with the psychology behind why this feeling is so common. Developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnett coined a term in the early 2000s that changed how researchers think about this stage of life. He called it emerging adulthood. It describes the period roughly between 18 and 30, sometimes stretching further, where a person is technically an adult, but hasn't settled into the stable roles that used to define adulthood. No fixed career. No permanent home. Relationships in flux. Identity still under construction. Arnett's research found that this stage is marked by 5 key features: identity exploration, instability, self-focus, feeling in between, and a sense of broad possibilities. Notice that 2 of those, instability and feeling in between, are almost guaranteed to produce anxiety. Your brain is wired to crave predictability. It wants to know where it stands. And emerging adulthood, by definition, denies you that certainty. But here's what makes today's experience of this stage different from, say, your parents' or grandparents': the sheer number of choices available to you. Previous generations often had fewer paths, which paradoxically made decisions easier. Fewer options means less decision fatigue. Psychologist Barry Schwartz described this in his research on what he called the paradox of choice. He found that when people are given too many options, they don't feel more free. They feel more anxious, more prone to second-guessing, and less satisfied with whatever they eventually choose. Now, layer that onto social media, where you're not just aware of a few paths other people have taken, you're aware of thousands, curated, filtered, and often exaggerated. The result is a nervous system that's constantly comparing your messy, unfinished, real life to everyone else's highlight reel. That's not a fair fight, and your brain doesn't know that. So, if you feel lost, it's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you're living through a stage of life that is psychologically defined by instability, surrounded by more choices and more comparison points than any generation before you has had to process. But understanding why this happens is only half the story. The other half is what your expectations are doing to make it feel so much worse. Let's talk about expectations, because this is where a lot of the unnecessary suffering comes from. Many of us grew up with an implicit script for how adulthood was supposed to unfold. Finish school, land a stable job, find a partner, buy a home, feel settled by some vague but specific age, usually somewhere around 30. This script isn't written down anywhere, but it's absorbed from movies, from family expectations, from the achievements we saw modeled around us. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a social clock, a term introduced by Bernice Newgarden back in the 1960s. The idea is simple. Society has an unspoken timeline for major life events, and we measure ourselves against it constantly, even when we don't realize we're doing it. The problem is that the social clock most of us inherited was built for a different economy, a different job market, and a different set of social norms. Home ownership, career stability, marriage timelines, all of these have shifted dramatically in the last few decades. Yet the emotional expectation, the internal sense of, I should be further along by now, often hasn't updated to match reality. This mismatch between an outdated script and current circumstances is a significant driver of what researchers call quarter-life crisis, or later 30-something crisis experiences. Here's the psychological mechanism at play. When there's a gap between where you expected to be and where you actually are, your brain interprets that gap as a threat. This isn't abstract. Studies on goal discrepancy, going back to psychologist Charles Carver's work on self-regulation, show that the size of the gap between your expected self and your actual self directly predicts feelings of anxiety and depression. The bigger the gap feels, the worse you feel. And critically, it doesn't matter whether the expectation was ever realistic in the first place. Your nervous system responds to the gap, not to whether the standard made sense. This explains why so many successful, capable people still feel lost. It's not that they haven't accomplished things. It's that whatever they've accomplished doesn't match some internalized, often outdated timeline they never consciously agreed to. There's a second layer here too, something psychologists call identity foreclosure versus genuine identity exploration. Some people settle into a career or a relationship early, not because they've explored who they are, but because settling reduces the discomfort of uncertainty. It looks like direction from the outside, but if it wasn't built through real exploration, it often produces a delayed version of the same lost feeling, sometimes arriving in the 40s instead of the 20s. Meanwhile, people who spend longer in the exploration phase often report more genuine life satisfaction later on, even though the process feels more uncomfortable in the moment. So to summarize the mechanism, you're in a developmental stage defined by instability, you're comparing yourself to a schedule that may no longer reflect reality, and your brain treats that mismatch as a genuine threat, rather than simply outdated information. No wonder it feels heavy. The good news is that once you understand this mechanism, you can start working with your brain instead of against it. That's what we'll cover next. Let's move into what you can actually do about this, because understanding the problem is only useful if it leads somewhere. The first strategy is what psychologists sometimes call process goals instead of outcome goals. An outcome goal is something like, I need to have my career figured out. It's vague, it's distant, and worst of all, it's binary. You either have it figured out or you don't, and most days it feels like you don't. A process goal, by contrast, focuses on the next concrete action. Instead of figure out my career, it becomes have one informational conversation with someone in a field I'm curious about this month. Research on goal setting, particularly the work of psychologists Edwin Locke and Gary Latham, consistently shows that specific, actionable goals produce more motivation and less anxiety than broad, identity-level goals. The shift here is subtle but powerful. You stop demanding that your whole life makes sense, and you start asking only what the next reasonable step might be. The second strategy addresses the comparison problem directly. Social comparison, especially the upward kind, where you compare yourself to people who appear further along, has been studied extensively since psychologist Leon Festinger first proposed social comparison theory back in the 1950s. His research suggested that we evaluate ourselves by comparing to others largely because objective standards are often unavailable. In the absence of a clear ruler, we use other people as the ruler instead. The trouble is that on social media, you're comparing your full, complicated internal experience to someone else's edited, external highlight reel. That's an inherently unfair comparison, and no amount of willpower fixes it. What works better, according to research on comparison and well-being, is shifting from social comparison to temporal comparison. Instead of asking, how do I compare to this other person? Ask, how do I compare to who I was a year ago? This single shift moves the comparison onto a fair playing field, one where you actually have context, and it tends to reveal progress that upward social comparison completely hides. The third strategy involves something psychologists call identity capital. This term, developed alongside Arnett's research on emerging adulthood, refers to the skills, experiences, and personal resources you build during periods of exploration, resources that pay off later, even if they don't feel directly connected to a clear path right now. A messy, winding 20s or 30s isn't wasted time if you're building identity capital along the way. Skills, relationships, self-knowledge, resilience. The research suggests that people who reframe their uncertain years as an active investment period, rather than as a failure to arrive somewhere, report significantly lower anxiety and higher long-term life satisfaction. The path doesn't have to be straight for it to be building something real. Put together, these three approaches, focusing on process goals instead of outcome goals, shifting from social comparison to temporal comparison, and recognizing the identity capital you're building even in uncertain periods, offer a genuinely different way to relate to feeling lost. Not by eliminating the uncertainty, because some uncertainty is simply part of this stage of life, but by changing what that uncertainty means to you. So where does that leave us? The feeling of being lost in your 20s and 30s isn't a sign that you're behind or broken. It's the predictable result of a developmental stage built on instability, layered with more choices and more comparison points than any previous generation has had to navigate, and measured against a social timeline that for many people no longer matches reality. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when it produces anxiety in that gap. It's doing exactly what brains are built to do when something doesn't match expectations. The problem was never you. It was the size and accuracy of the map you were handed. Once you see the mechanism clearly, the path forward changes. You stop demanding a finished identity and start taking the next concrete step. You stop measuring yourself against a stranger's highlight reel and start measuring yourself against who you were last year. And you start to see the winding, uncertain parts of this stage not as wasted time, but as identity capital, resources you're quietly building that will matter more than you can currently see. None of this means the discomfort disappears overnight. Uncertainty is genuinely part of this stage of life, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But there's a real difference between uncertainty that feels like drowning and uncertainty that feels like walking through fog with a flashlight. You may not be able to see the whole road, but you can see the next few steps, and it turns out that's usually enough to keep moving. If this video helped put language to something you've been feeling, you're exactly who this channel is made for. We explore the psychology behind the everyday experiences that so many people go through in silence, the stuff that rarely gets explained clearly, but that shapes how we feel far more than we realize. If you'd like more videos like this, one that actually explain the why behind what you're feeling, instead of just offering surface-level advice, consider subscribing. New videos come out regularly, each one digging into a different part of the human experience through the lens of psychological research, translated into language that actually makes sense. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Wherever you are in your own path, however finished or unfinished it feels right now, I hope you leave this video with a little more clarity and a little more patience with yourself. You're not behind. You're becoming. And that process was never supposed to be finished yet. I'll see you in the next one.